Daniel chapter 9, and if you'd open your Bible, verse 20. Daniel was reading the book of Jeremiah. Interesting, one of the prophets is reading a prophet. Daniel's reading the book of Jeremiah, and as he's reading the book of Jeremiah, he comes to the prophecy that children of Israel would be in captivity for 70 years, and now they had already been there for 68 years. And he realizes we're coming to the end of our captivity. God's about to free us from Babylon and allow us to go back into Jerusalem. And because of it, he begins to pray. And because he realized the time's close. You know, we're going to be able to return back to our homeland. We're going to be able to go rebuild the temple again. We're going to be able to sacrifice at that temple again. And God is going to, be with us in our midst again. And as Daniel was praying and confessing his sin and the sins of his forefathers, it says that an angel shows up and begins to speak to him. It's Gabriel. Now, we're kind of looked at it a little bit last week, but Gabriel's an interesting character because Gabriel's the one who announces the Messiah to Zechariah in Luke's account, and to Mary. It's Gabriel that comes and says, you are going to bear a child, without a man involved. It's going to be the virgin birth, and Gabriel's the one who reveals that to Mary. So Gabriel is a very instrumental angel when it comes to the unveiling of the Messiah coming onto the scene, and that's exactly what he does in chapter 9. It's incredible. Notice what happens. We're going to pick up in verse 20. He says, now, Daniel's writing this, now, while I was speaking and praying and confessing my sins and the sins of my people Israel, presenting my supplication before the Lord my God for the holy mountain of my God. Now, understand something. Daniel's prayer was revolved around Jerusalem. And as he was praying for Jerusalem and for the people who inhabited Jerusalem, that would have been his ancestors, the Jews. He begins to ask God, what are you going to do with us? How are you, all of prophecy, whenever you're looking at prophecy always revolves around the nation of Israel and the city of Jerusalem. Not the United States, not any other nation. It all revolves around the nation of Israel because those are God's chosen people. And what's incredible is that Daniel acknowledges, look, I was praying what God is going to do in his holy mountain. That was the Mount Zion, Jerusalem. And notice what happens. He says, verse 21, yes, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, he reached me, watch this, about the time of the evening offerings. Now, the angel flew swiftly. And we don't know, what does that mean? He just kind of showed up on the scene. God kind of says, hey, Daniel's praying. You got to go explain to him what's about to happen. But he shows up very quickly. When we get to chapter 10, he's going to tell us about Daniel praying on another vision, and for 21 days he doesn't get an answer. So it's interesting that in this particular vision and this particular prayer, Daniel immediately gets his answer. He says he was praying and around the evening offering. Now here's another interesting note. Sacrifices weren't taking place. They hadn't been taking place for over 68 years. But still everything revolved for Daniel because he was a man of God, and he was a man who had faith and a man who believed that God had designed, his temple, and the offerings were to be offered up. Everything still revolved around that for him. He still understood, this was when the sacrifices would have been offered up to God. And it was right around the evening time of sacrifice that, they would sacrifice in the morning, they would sacrifice in the evening at the temple every day. And he's saying, right at that same time frame is when the angel shows up, Gabriel shows up. And Gabriel shows up and he begins to speak to Daniel. Notice what he says, verse 22, and he informed me. He talked with me. And he said, "Oh, Daniel, I have now come forth to give you," check this out, "skill to understand. At the beginning of your supplication, the command went out, and I have come to tell you, you are greatly beloved. Therefore, consider the matter," watch this, "and understand the vision." So Gabriel has a mission. It's to help Daniel understand the things he had been praying for. What he had been praying for? For the holy mountain, for the nation of Israel, for the temple that God dwelt in. And it's amazing because as he now tells them, Daniel, understand something, you are beloved by God. God loves you. Can you imagine that's the message an angel brings you? God loves you. Well, we know in the New Testament, we're told that often, for God so loved the world that he gave his son. He calls us the beloved, right? We're his sons and his daughters. God loves us. To those that have acknowledged him as Lord, to those who have confessed him as their Savior, those who acknowledge that he is the one who rules in the affairs of man. And Daniel receives this, you're beloved by God. God hears your prayer, Daniel. God, desires, your fellowship, Daniel. God concerned about your concerns, Daniel. Guys, that's true of us. Because you and I have access to the throne room of heaven. That's mind-boggling. That anytime we pray, it's like incense that it's, ascending to the throne room of heaven, and God sees it as a sweet-smelling aroma. Can you imagine? God takes pleasure in our prayers. God takes pleasure when we seek him. And his desire is to answer prayer. His desire is to intervene in our concerns and our cares, as he was for Daniel. And as Daniel is there, just kind of taking all this in, and Gabriel's telling him, look, I want you to consider the matter and understand the vision. It's one thing to just hear truth or to hear what God says. It's a whole other thing to ponder it, to consider it, just to kind of go, man, what does that mean to me? How does that apply to me? What do I do with the things that God's just declared, the things that God shows me? It's one thing just to let it go one ear and out the other, but it's a whole other thing to sit down and consider, what is God saying? What is God saying? What does that mean for me personally? And he says, I want you to consider these things. I want you to have understanding of these things. And so he begins the prophecy, the vision in verse 24. 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city, to finish the transgressions, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up visions and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. And so what the angel declares to Daniel is that God has determined for 70 weeks to transpire for the nation of Israel. And you first read it, wait, what do you mean 70 weeks? I mean, how 70 weeks, what's that, 490 days? What does that look like? You see, in the scriptures, you'll find that this word weeks is used for groups of 7. It's not just 7 days, it could be 7 years. the nation of Israel, they were to work the land for 6 years, and on the 7th year, they were to let the land rest. That was a week of years. They were to labor for 6 days there. On the 7th day, they were to let they were to rest themselves, and that was the Sabbath day. So when God speaks of weeks, it's not always in the same time frame that you and I think of weeks in. It's weeks of days, and there's weeks of years. And so when he's declaring here, and it's interesting. Turn real quick, just to show you how God declares it. Go to Leviticus chapter 25, just so you see how this plays out. Leviticus chapter 25. Look at verse 1. And the Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, speak to the children of Israel, say to them, when you come into the land which I give you, then the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyards and gather in fruit. But in the 7th year you shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the Lord, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard. What grows on it on its own accord, your own harvest you shall not reap, nor gather the grapes of the untended vine, for it is a year of rest for the land, and the Sabbath produce of the land shall be food for you, for your male, your female servants, your hired and strangers who dwell in thee, for your livestock and the beasts that are in the field, all its produce shall be for food. You see, God had laid out this whole picture of 7 years. So when he's talking here, he's talking about 70 years, or 70 weeks. But he's not 490 days, but 490 years. Okay, so just so you wrap your mind around it, when this is what God is declaring to Daniel. Israel's existence, everything that's going to happen to Israel when it comes to a biblical sense is going to happen in a 490-year period. Now, at the end of that 490-year period, here's what he declares. It's going to be the end of transgression. It's going to be the end of sins. It's going to be a reconciliation for iniquity. It's going to bring in an everlasting righteousness. And he says it's going to seal up visions and prophecy. As what he's declaring is at the end of the 490 years, all of it's completed. Every prophecy ever given is done. That's the end of the age. That's the end of time, as you and I know it. So this 490-year period that he's referencing is saying this is what's going to seal up everything. This is when it's all going to come to an end. All prophecy will have been fulfilled at the end of this 490-year period. So what he's declaring is that God's plan for the nation of Israel would be wrapped up in that time frame. And God's plan for the world would also be wrapped up in that time frame. So what does that look? What does that even mean, right? What does that look like? Now, I would encourage you. The last event that the book of Revelation declares is when the new heavens and the new earth come down. It's when God redoes everything. It's when everything gets fixed. It's when sin no longer has any power. It's when the righteous king rules over everything. Jesus, that's when all of that happens. It's at the end of the 490-year period. And you may be thinking, wait a second, Daniel's saying these things. It was 2,500 years ago, 490 years. What does that mean? Now, go to verse 25, because, guys, I think here is just incredible. Watch what he says. Know, therefore, and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and to build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublesome times. So he says a total of 69 weeks are going to transpire. He broke it up into 2 different groups of weeks. He said the first one's going to be a 7-week or 49-year period that's going to happen after the command to go and to rebuild to rebuild Jerusalem. Right? That was there in verse 25, to restore and to build Jerusalem. Now, Daniel is going to be alive when that first wave of exiles return back to Jerusalem. And their first goal is going to be to rebuild the temple. They're going to go in, and if you get a chance to read the book of Ezra, you find out that, they go back. It was very discouraging. There was a lot of difficulty in order to rebuild the temple. The people started to build their own houses. They neglected the house of the Lord, and it was just a very trying time for the nation of Israel. So they were rebuilding the temple, but it was a very long, slow process. When you get to Nehemiah chapter 2, the temple's built, but what had happened is that the walls around Jerusalem that really brought the security and the safety to the nation weren't built yet. The streets were still demolished. The temple was standing. And what happens is that a decree by Artaxerxes is given, and the decree in Nehemiah chapter 2 is given. And in Nehemiah chapter 2, it would have been in 444 BC. That Nehemiah is given the command to go build the walls around Jerusalem and to build the streets around Jerusalem back to its original glory. Now, that would have taken place and completed 49 years after the decree to go back and rebuild had happened. And many believe that's why that Daniel breaks it up into 7 weeks and then 62 weeks. Because the completion of the walls around Jerusalem would have transpired at the 7-week period, and then 62 weeks would have transpired, and that's when another event takes place. And that next event, he tells us here, is the event that would now bring in the Messiah. There's been a lot of work done by different scholars throughout the years. They're going, what do these numbers look like? How does that transpire? 483 years. 69 times 7 is 483. It's 173,880 days. If you divide that by 360, that's what a year in a biblical year would look like. Not 365 days like our year looks like. There's a 360-day year calendar. And in that 360-day year calendar, it would have from 444 BC to 32 AD. What happens in 32 AD? On March of 32 AD, Jesus comes riding in on a donkey. And some of these scholars have literally pulled out calendars and to the day been able to mark that Monday when Jesus got on the donkey and rode down into Jerusalem, declaring himself as the Messiah, and then just 4 days later hanging on a cross. And this prophecy fulfilled as Daniel declared it, 483 years to the day after Artaxerxes gave the command to go rebuild to Nehemiah in Nehemiah chapter 2. Guys, this is what's incredible. The Jews to this very day tell their people, don't read the book of Daniel. It's too holy. You'll never understand it. Understand something. The Jews who do not believe the Messiah has come yet, when you read Daniel chapter 9, have to come to the same conclusion that you and I have come to, that the day that he came is already past, according to prophecy. And that day would have been in 32, or I think it was March of 33 AD, actually. Or 32 AD. And I have that. Yeah, 32 AD, March of 32 AD. That's when Jesus would have come riding in on the donkey, and then just a few days later, hung on a cross. And so the reason they don't want them to read this, because it just declares everything that we know to be true. They're still waiting for their Messiah. What we do know, and we'll get into it the next couple of weeks, is that when the Antichrist comes on the scene, the Jews are going to believe it's the Messiah, and they're going to begin to follow him. Incredible. Because they're still waiting for their Messiah, but he's a false Messiah. But what's amazing is, as you look at this, he tells them to the detail, the walls are going to be built again. You know, the walls around Jerusalem, the streets are going to be built again. It's going to be in troublesome times. It's going to be a very daunting task. Nehemiah gets the command. He goes back in Jerusalem, and 52 days they put up the wall around Jerusalem, and they begin to restore the city of Jerusalem in 52-day period, because God had gone before them, and he had began to, knit the hearts of the people together and remove all of the obstacles that they had been facing. All of prophecy, guys, everything that God declares would happen, happens. And what's amazing is as you look at this whole thing play out, he's going to tell us the second part of that prophecy. It's there in verse 26. Watch what he says. After the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off. What's he referring to? The end of 62 weeks brought forth the Messiah, the Prince, coming in. That would have been that Monday before the crucifixion, to the day, 483 years. Messiah, the Prince, announces that he's the king that Zechariah had prophesied about. Zechariah 9:9, behold, your king is coming to you. He is just and having salvation, lowly and riding on a donkey. So Zechariah had prophesied that that's how the Messiah would reveal himself. Luke chapter 19 tells us in verse 28 through 40 that Jesus fulfilled that prophecy just like Zechariah prophesied, but just like Daniel also prophesied, that he would show up on that day. And after 62 weeks, when the 62 weeks were completed, which would have been the Monday that he rides in the donkey, the Messiah would be cut off or crucified. And notice what it says here. He'll be cut off, but not for himself. He wasn't cut off for his own purpose. He was cut off for you. He hung on a cross to pay the penalty for sin for all of humanity that would call upon him. He didn't do it for himself. It wasn't. He didn't gain anything for himself out of it. He gained you and I as a result of what he did on that cross some 2,000 years ago. And it's what astounds me, guys, is you look at this text and you realize that all of this was God's design. All of it was God's plan. From not only the foundations of the world, but is now telling Daniel, there's a certain time frame that's got to be fulfilled. And 69 years have already been completed. The Messiah now having been cut off. And there's 1 week remaining that God has to fulfill for the nation of Israel. To fulfill the 490 weeks, or the 490 years, or the 70 weeks, 69 of them being complete, there's 1 week left. We do know this, and we'll dive into this the next couple of weeks. We're not going to get that far this week, but we'll dive into the next few weeks. Here's what we do know. We know that the Antichrist is going to make a covenant with the nation of Israel for 1 week, 7 years. And in the middle of the 7 years, and all of this is laid out here, and we'll come back on it, but I'm just trying to give you the bigger picture here. In the middle of the 7-year period, 3.5 years in, the Antichrist is going to go into the temple, because they will be sacrificing once again at the temple, and he's going to go in there and say, you can no longer sacrifice to God, you got to worship me. That's what the devil's going to do. It's the Antichrist empowered by the devil. And he's going to defile the temple. It's called the abomination of desolation that Daniel spoke about, is what Jesus said. What fascinates me about all of this, guys, is that up until this point, Israel became a nation less than 80 years ago now. They've been regathered together as a nation. And the defender and the ally that has supported the nation of Israel has been the United States of America. We have been by their side defending them for the last close to 80 years. The concern right now, as you've been watching the news and what's going on with Afghanistan right now, is that we're no longer the nation that is able to defend anybody. Right now, if you read the Russian news, if you read the Chinese news, they're saying we are no longer in a American-run world, that America is now out of the picture. And what's incredible about that is that in Ezekiel chapter 38, it's Iran and Russia, along with Libya and many other nations, that are going to gather together, and they're going to attack the nation of Israel. That's the biblical prophecy. And I think it's all being set up right now. It's like a chessboard. Everything's falling into place. And we're just waiting now, because if we become if China, no longer thinks that we're going to protect anybody anymore, one of the things they want to do is they want to now seize Taiwan and overtake Taiwan and make them part of China, which is going to be devastating to our dollar. If you know anything what's going on, all of our computer chips come from Taiwan. That's kind of what's holding us up right now. Once Taiwan is taken by China, man, our dollar will go to nothing. Russia has been waiting for this day, that we no longer have the fortitude or the will or the power to stand up. Iran has called for the death of Israel ever since they became a nation. And all of these three guys, these three main superpowers, are becoming allies as we speak. And so you look at all this, and you realize that all of these things that are transpiring, all these things that Daniel's prophesying, he's telling us, look, all of this is already determined. This is already going to happen. We already know how this all ends. It all ends just like God declared it's going to end. 69 weeks completed, 1 week yet to be fulfilled. The Messiah already been cut off. And you and I are living in what's called the days of the times of the Gentiles. It's a gap from the 69 weeks to the 70th week. The 7th week is when sin's dealt with, when, he gives that whole list there, in reconciliation for iniquity takes place, everlasting righteousness takes place, the sealing up of all the visions. That's what happens after the last final week. In between all of that is we've been living for the last 2,000 years. The time of the Gentiles. When Paul is writing to the Romans, remember Paul's writing to the Romans after Israel had already been destroyed and the temple had already been destroyed. Watch, turn to Romans chapter 11 with me. Look there in verse. Now let's take this whole section here. I think it's an incredible section. Because what God is declaring is that God's not done with Israel. God still has a plan for the nation of Israel. God's still going to fulfill that plan for the nation of Israel. And that plan is that final week of world history that's got to take place. And notice what he says. He's talking about the Gentiles who are saying, the Jews, God's done with the Jews. We've now replaced the Jews. The Jews have rejected the Messiah. Therefore, God has, no use for them any longer. And Paul in the book of Romans is saying, wait a second, man. God's not done with Israel. God's plans for Israel hasn't been fulfilled yet. And watch what he says in start in verse 17. There's a lot more to that, but watch what he says. If some of the branches were broken off and you, speaking of the Gentiles, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them and with them became a partaker of the root and fatness of the olive tree, do not boast against the branches, but if you do boast, remember that you do not support the root, but the root supports you. He's saying, look, this is all revolving around Israel. We were grafted into God's plan. It wasn't the other way around. We, the Gentiles, were part of what God was doing. And then he says this, well said, because of unbelief they were broken off, verse 20. And you stand by faith, do not be haughty, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branch, he may not spare you either. Amen. Therefore, consider the goodness and the severity of God on those who fell, severity, but toward you goodness, if you continue in his goodness. Otherwise, you also be cut off. And they also, if they do not continue in unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. For you were cut off of the olive tree, which is a wild by nature, grafted in contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree. How much more will these who are natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? And then look at verse 25. For I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of the mystery, lest you be wise in your own opinion, that blindness in part has happened to Israel. Till when? Till the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Wow. There's a blinder over the nation of Israel right now. But that blinder is going to be, the scales off their eyes are going to be removed at some point. It's when the fullness of the Gentile comes in. In other words, at one point, God says, okay, no longer am I dealing with the Gentiles. I'm dealing specifically with the nation of Israel. That's the 7 last years of world history, or the 7th week of Daniel. And God's no longer going to be dealing with the other nations. That's when his wrath is going to be poured out upon all of the nations that have rejected him. So this time period where God's going to be dealing with the nation of Israel, this last 7 years, he's going to be dealing specifically with the nation of Israel, but he's also at that same time going to bring his wrath upon the nations who've rejected him throughout history. It's all God's design, it's all God's plan, and it's coming to fruition. You don't have to look far, guys, to know that all of these things are set up right now. You really have to have blinders on to not know that things are changing rapidly. They're moving us into a very unique time in history right now. If you're watching the movement of nations right now, you're watching things that you and I never thought we would see. And I don't think we're in the 7-year period, but I think we are definitely getting prepared for that 7-year period as we speak. Because there's going to be a time period where you're not going to be able to buy, sell, or trade unless you take a mark. There's going to come a time period when a one world government is going to be put into place. A one world monetary system, a one world religious system. All of these things are going to be, you're going to have to make allegiance there, or you're not going to be able to function in the world that we're living in, and you're going to have to die for your faith. That's going to happen during the last 7 years of world history. Now, I believe, and I think the Bible validates, that those who will put their faith in him will be removed from this world before the 7 years begins. The Bible references as the great snatching away, the great harpazo will take place. It means God's going to come back for his church, for his bride, and he's going to take them to the marriage supper of the Lamb, and we will be with him for that 7-year period in heaven. And then the earth is going to be void of the church who they despise. And God's wrath is going to be poured out upon the remainder of the Gentiles who've rejected him. And God is going to be dealing very specifically with the nation of Israel. Matter of fact, it tells us in the book of Revelation that 144,000 virgins, they're going to be young men who have never known a woman, they're going to be now witnesses of his. 144,000 are going to be anointed. They're going to be sealed by God, and they're going to go out and they're going to proclaim the gospel to the rest of the world. Incredible. And you and I are looking at these prophecies in Daniel chapter 9, and we find, as you're looking at them, you go, man, the 69 weeks happened just like God declared they would happen. To the very day, from the time that Artaxerxes gave the command to go build Jerusalem to the time the Messiah came and was pronounced king, 483 years to the day, just like God said. He also gives another prophecy. Look, there in verse 26, he says, after the 62 weeks, the Messiah shall be cut off, not for himself, and the people of the prince who is to come. Now, he's talking about the future leader of this world. Watch what he says. Shall destroy the city and the sanctuary until the end of the war, desolations are determined. Now, he mentions the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. Now, after the Messiah was cut off, some 38 years later, Titus, with his Roman army, came into Jerusalem and destroyed Jerusalem again. Just like Daniel prophesied. In 70 AD, it was a total annihilation. Every stone in the building, just like Jesus prophesied, every stone in the building will come down. As they lit the sanctuary on fire, the gold that was inside the sanctuary seeped in between the stones, and they literally tore every stone apart to get the gold that was in between the crevices of the temple, and they literally took every stone apart that was in the temple, just like Jesus prophesied. Incredible. And here we are, what I would call the end of the age. We're here at just waiting for the return of Christ. All of these systems already in place. This one monetary system, it could be put into place tomorrow. I don't know if you're watching what's going on, guys, but in Australia right now, you cannot leave your house unless you have a passport. The COVID passport, the vaccine passport. Unless you have that, you are not allowed to leave your house. I was talking to someone here in our own community who said that, they would not be treated in the hospital here in our backyard until they took the jab. It's just more and more, there's this kind of pressing in of power over us, and our freedoms be taken away. And it's conditioning. It's preparing. And we're watching all of this. I'm just waiting for this saying, unless you do what we tell you to do, you can't have a bank account. That's when you kind of like, woo, woo, woo. Sirens go off. Because now it's like you just can't go to this place. And now you can't even trade. You can't even sell. And as you're watching all of this transpire, you realize that Daniel here is prophesying these things. Daniel's here declaring these things. He's saying, look, there's a 70-week period that's got to be fulfilled for the nation of Israel. 69 of them, once the Messiah is cut off, fulfilled. One last final week's got to be fulfilled, and that fulfillment will take place. And when it takes place, after that 70th week takes place, then it's all the prophecies are done. All of the visions that were given, all of it being fulfilled, and God now begins his new heaven, his new earth, and he begins to reestablish things with his righteousness reigning over all of it. Incredible. And you and I stand in a very strategic part in world history. I'm not a prophet. I don't claim to think, hey guys, we got 1 year or 5 years or 10 years or 20 years left. This could be a process that takes some time. I have no idea. No man knows the day or the hour, the scripture says. None of us can go, we got 4 weeks left or 6 months left or 2 years. No one knows. But Jesus did say, when you see these things begin to happen, look up. For your redemption draws nigh. In other words, when it starts to head that way, it's not going to take long for it to actually transpire. And so I hold on to that, man. My redemption's getting close. Now, I would love it if, before we left here, we just kind of got taken out. I don't know about you. I would be excited, just like, man, we were there talking about Daniel chapter 9, and the 70th week of Daniel, and then boom, we were gone. How cool would that story be to tell the Apostle Paul? You wouldn't believe it. We were talking to tell Daniel, we were just studying your book, and then boom, we were here. That'd be a great story. I do remember a time. You see, I grew up, my mom was a Christian, I wasn't a Christian. I grew up, my dad was a partier. He smoked pot. I don't remember a day when my dad didn't get drunk or smoke pot as a kid. Around 12 years old, I was going to church with my mom, and I pulled my dad aside and I said, Dad, Jesus is coming back. You need to be ready. I don't want you to miss him. My dad pulled me to his, and my mom had went to church that night. I told him, Mom, I want to stay back and I want to share with Dad, because I was having dreams at that time that the Lord was coming back, and, my whole family was with him in heaven, and my dad wasn't there. And, as a 12-year-old, like, man, I love Dad. I don't want him to miss the Lord coming. And I remember just saying, go to church. I'm going to stay with Dad. And and had such a great respect for my dad. Loved my dad, still do. I mean, he's in heaven now, but still great respect for him, even because everything he did was because that's all he knew. You just realized that he had a rough life, and my grandfather was an alcoholic, and it was just that's all he knew. And I remember staying back with my dad that night, and my dad said, son, your mom's brainwashing you. Come here. And he took me to the back bathroom. 12 years old, took me to the back bathroom, and he lit up a joint. And I got high that night with Pops for the next 10 years. Drugs, partying, living a very immoral life. But one of those nights, I remember I was probably a year or two after starting to smoke dope and party with Dad. And one of those nights, I was outside playing basketball with my friends. We were out shooting hoops. I thought it was, one of those nights where you're just gonna, just hang out with the boys. And we were shooting hoops. And one of my friends looks up to the sky. Now, my mom was all into prophecy. She was always telling us, you got to be ready. Jesus is coming back at any moment. And I remember looking up in the sky, and there was a rainbow around the cloud, around the moon. It was just this big rainbow. And one of the guys says, man, that's crazy. Isn't that what's supposed to happen when Jesus comes back? And I remember, nowhere in the Bible does it say that, but that he just, I didn't know that he didn't say that. And I remember going, oh no, I missed him. My first thought, and I remember running home. Messed up my whole buzz and everything. Ran home full speed, man. Ran home, mom, if my mom's here, I'm good. That's all I knew. If mom's here, I'm safe, right? And I go into the kitchen where mom usually is, and I'm looking in the kitchen, and whatever she was boiling over the pot. And I went into her bedroom, into her bathroom, and now panic is in my face. And I go into the living room, and I sit down in my living room, and I'm weeping. I'm going, God, I blew it. You came, and I wasn't ready. And right about then, Mom comes around the corner. What's the matter, mijo? Nothing. Nothing at all, Mom. Just sitting here. And that day has always affected me. Because I know there's going to come a day when he does come back. And there's going to be hundreds and thousands of people that aren't going to be ready. And they're not going to know, what do I do now? For the next 7 years of my life, I'm going to have to try to function in a world that's rejected God. And God's wrath is going to be poured out. And the result is I'm probably going to have to die for my faith, or I'm going to have to go along with the system and spend eternity in hell. Can you imagine what that day will be like? For thousands of Christians who knew, or thousands of people who knew truth but didn't surrender to truth. And my prayer, man, that won't be one of us. That it wouldn't be you or I. But that we would be those who say, God, I want to know you. I want to be forgiven for my sins. I want to know what righteousness is. I want to follow you now before it's too late.